Welcome to the Curious Case, where every mystery unfolds like a whispered secret by the fireside. Today we delve into a story wrapped in ivy-covered shadows and long-buried whispers, an original tale of quiet dread and sharp intuition, starring none other than the ever-perceptive and elegantly tenacious Miss Marple. So settle in with your tea, or something stronger, and prepare to lose yourself in a mystery, where every glance hides a truth, and every silence, a secret. And before we begin, do leave a quick comment, and share where you're joining us from. It's always a joy to know how far our little detective circle stretches. Now, let's begin Miss Marple, and the echoes behind the wall. It began as many strange stories do, with a letter, one penned in violet ink on thin ivory paper, scented faintly, with something floral and old-fashioned, like time itself. The sender, a Lady Calderwood, widow of a reclusive nobleman, and scarcely seen in public since the war. The invitation was oddly formal for a village charity event, but what caught Miss Marple's attention wasn't the handwriting, nor the wax seal, it was the location, Weatherly Grange, a manor whispered about but seldom entered. Once a place of glittering parties and political power, it had since grown still, its windows shuttered, its garden left to choke itself in silence. The day Miss Marple arrived, a storm brewed low and heavy above the hills, casting a bruised light over the Grange. Ivy clung desperately to its stone facade, and the fountain in the courtyard gurgled faintly, as if remembering something it couldn't forget. The door was opened not by a butler, but by a woman with hollow eyes and a stiff, practiced smile. Lady Calderwood's niece, who barely spoke and avoided Miss Marple's gaze. Inside the air was thick, not with dust, but with the sort of hush one finds in places where too much has been overheard. Guests mingled, though awkwardly. No music, no laughter, just forced pleasantries and eyes that darted like mice from shadow to shadow. When Miss Marple was introduced to the host, she noted the woman's trembling hands and distracted glances, as though listening to something no one else could hear. And then someone, a distant cousin, perhaps spoke of the room. The one sealed since the death of Lord Calderwood. A room, they whispered, that had never been entered since. No one knew why. Or rather, no one said why. Some claimed it was grief. Others suggested scandal. But a few, leaning in close, said it was for safety. Because what was locked in wasn't meant to be let out. It began not with a whisper or a scream, but with the low hum of a melody, barely audible, drifting from a part of the estate that, according to the floor plans, did not exist. Miss Alara Wynne, invited under the polite guise of a historical consultant, had sensed it the moment she stepped into Ashbourne Hollow. The way shadows lingered too long in corners, how chandeliers trembled without breeze, and how the hosts exchanged tight-lipped glances whenever certain corridors were mentioned. It was not the grandeur of the estate that fascinated her, but the strange vacancy that clung to its west wing, like a story half erased. During the garden soiree, laughter floated like perfume across the trimmed hedges, yet Alara felt the weight of eyes from behind shuttered windows, watching with a hunger older than the building itself. Then came the child, barefoot, dirt-smeared, whispering about a door that moved when no one touched it. The guests laughed it off, until a dog refused to enter the corridor, and barked at an untouched wall until its voice cracked. Alara followed her instincts, tracing the echoes to a panel where the wallpaper was newer than the rest, the air colder. When she pressed it, the wall sighed open, dust exhaled like breath held for decades. A passage led downward, not merely into the bowels of the house, but into something far older, carved from stone slick with age and silence. It was not empty. The walls were covered in charcoal drawings, dozens of faces, all wide-eyed, all screaming, all drawn with the same shaking hand. At the end stood a door bound in iron, and behind it the sound of soft, deliberate breathing. Alara didn't flinch. She had not come for the roses, the silk napkins, or the wine, but for this, the truth that every home with a locked room tries to forget, that some secrets don't die in the dark. They wait, and then, without warning, the silence fractured like glass. Amelia Blackthorne stepped forward, her curiosity barely masked by the urgency in her eyes. The chest was ancient, its hinges crusted with rust, yet it yielded with an aching groan, releasing a gust of air so heavy with mildew, old ink, and something strangely sweet, like dried violets left too long in the sun. It made them all instinctively recoil. Inside, a tangle of forgotten lives, tarnished spectacles tangled in a faded lace glove, a child's drawing charred at the edges, a velvet ribbon still knotted as if last touched in haste. Near the bottom lay an envelope, sealed in blood-red wax with a symbol no one recognized. But it was the book, an unassuming cloth-bound volume, that drew Amelia's fingers, trembling yet determined. It felt heavier than it should, as though time itself had curled up inside its pages. As the guests whispered among themselves, the atmosphere thickened, not just with dust and decay, but with the weight of something darker. Lady Winslow's face blanched the moment her gaze locked on the book. Her hand, veined and trembling, clutched her cane as if it could hold back whatever memory had just risen from that chest. Amelia watched the old woman keenly, noting the exact moment fear eclipsed surprise. Lady Winslow didn't faint like a heroine in a novel. She buckled silent and slow, as though dragged down by the years she had spent burying whatever that book threatened to expose. The others moved in a flurry of concern, but Amelia remained rooted, her eyes scanning the room with quiet precision. One guest, a stoic nephew from the north, leaned forward a breath too eagerly. Another, the housemaid, stood with her back turned, her gloved hands knotted so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Even Thomas, the ever-collected butler, flinched when the envelope shifted in the breeze, revealing just a trace of red ink beneath. The room was no longer simply a gathering place. It had become a battleground of secrets, where every glance carried weight and every silence hinted at betrayal. As they helped Lady Winslow back to the hall, a young boy tugged at Amelia's sleeve, pointing to the floor with wide, uncertain eyes. There, barely visible in the dim afternoon glow, was a small glistening trail, fresh, wet and crimson, leading not away from the chest, but toward it. Amelia said nothing, but in her mind, the story had already begun, one written not with ink, but with guilt, fear, and the kind of truth that refused to stay buried. It was just before dawn when the silence of Blackthorn Manor broke, not with a scream or a crash, but with the low, deliberate creak of a door that should have remained locked for over 40 years. Elsie, the youngest maid barely out of girlhood, had come early to prepare the drawing room for the morning guests. She paused at the threshold, heart stuttering as her eyes registered the faint trail of muddy footprints on the marble, fresh, leading inward. The room was cold, unnaturally so, as though the fire had not been lit in weeks despite last night's roaring hearth. But it was the scent that unsettled her most. Not decay, but violets, strong and choking, like perfume applied in fear. At the center of the rug, beneath the great chandelier, lay the body, twisted unnaturally, one arm flung out as if reaching, the other clenched tightly to her chest. Her face was half hidden by her hair, but the unmistakable glint of emerald earrings, family heirlooms, made identification instant. It was Eleanor Cavendish, the family's quiet shadow, presumed to have left the estate years ago after a whispered scandal. A pale blue ribbon, old and frayed, was knotted tightly around her neck. It wasn't just murder. It was a message. The scream brought the household running. Half-dressed guests, stunned servants, and Lord Cavendish himself, who arrived breathless but strangely composed. Lady Helena swayed against the banister, her hand not on her chest, but clenched into a white-knuckled fist. Miss Arabelle Green, the family's sharp-eyed guest of no particular relation, stood silently in the corner, her knitting bag untouched at her feet. She watched, always watching. In the hour that followed, chaos disguised itself as protocol. Tea was brewed, condolences murmured, rooms sealed off. But Arabelle saw the tells. The butler's shoes, still wet despite no sign of rain. The scullery maid's missing pin, the one with the serpent's eye. And Richard Cavendish, the prodigal son, who hadn't spoken Eleanor's name in years, now stared at the ribbon as if it had come to life. The drawing room buzzed with low, frantic voices, speculating about curses, ghosts, revenge, anything to avoid the truth clawing at the edges. For as Eleanor lay dead in the room once known as the Violet Chamber, a second discovery was made. The locked drawer in the library desk had been forced open. Inside, an old letter, dated 32 years ago, was missing. Arabelle didn't need to read it. She had seen that envelope before. It was what Eleanor had once begged to burn. As breakfast was laid out untouched, the guests tried to swallow eggs and fear in equal measure. But the silence between bites said everything. Someone in this house had waited years for vengeance. And last night, the past had clawed its way up from the floorboards, wearing violet perfume and secrets sharp enough to kill. The breakfast table at Renmore Manor bore the same brittle elegance it had for decades. Silver slightly tarnished, napkins folded with military precision, and conversation sharpened like blades. Every glance was a calculation, every sentence a mask. Laughter rang too loud, words chosen too carefully, as if each guest were weighing not what they said, but what might be overheard. Old wounds peeked through brittle smiles, land disputes cloaked as family anecdotes, marriages spoken of with strained admiration, and the ever-present shadow of inheritance that made every toast feel like a countdown. At the head of the table, Miss Evelyn Grey stirred her tea exactly 13 times. A habit not of superstition, but observation. Her eyes weren't on the people, but on the absences between them. The sudden pause when the second wife mentioned the East Wing, the twitch in the old general's moustache, when the word bastard flitted across a joke. These were the fractures in the facade. By the time the sun had fully risen, Evelyn had mapped an entire web of quiet betrayals and deeply rooted desperation that stretched back further than any ledger or family tree would admit. Alone in the library, where the dust refused to settle, she stared at the portrait of Lenora Wren, a woman erased from the records, but never from the whispers. Lenora, whose bedroom door had been sealed shut not out of reverence, but out of terror. They said she had vanished after the winter ball of 1897. Leaving behind a streak of crimson across the marble hallway, and a room that locked from the inside. But Evelyn knew better, knew that locks meant nothing to grief, and silence was often the loudest clue. The villagers still spoke of the curse, of the boy with ink-black eyes who wandered the garden at dusk, of the song heard beneath the floorboards on moonless nights. But curses, Evelyn believed, were created by those with something to hide. They served as barriers, as warnings, as lies told often enough to become truth. She listened as the baker's widow recalled a fire no one had spoken of in years, and as the groundskeeper hinted at a hidden will signed in blood. No one remembered who built the tunnel beneath the chapel, but everyone remembered who disappeared after using it. And when Evelyn, guided by rumor and instinct, placed her hand upon the cold iron latch of the forbidden chamber, she did not feel fear, but the unmistakable breath of history holding its tongue. Whatever had begun that winter night hadn't ended. Not yet. The rain tapped against the carriage windows, like impatient fingers, as Eleanor Vane stepped onto the gravel path of Grimsby Hollow, an estate so burdened by shadows, it seemed the trees bent inward, listening. She had come not as an invited guest, but as an executor of an inheritance veiled in silence and death. Inside the manor was thick with the scent of faded roses, and a deeper rot beneath, one not of mold or time, but of memory. The portraits along the corridor followed her with watchful eyes, and somewhere beyond the drawing room, a clock ticked off beat, as if resisting the truth of time. Conversation around the dinner table was a careful choreography of glances and pauses, every guest performing civility, while privately measuring secrets. Names were avoided, relationships rephrased. It wasn't what was said, but what was swallowed mid-sentence that screamed loudest. And as Eleanor observed the cold smiles and clenched forks, she recognized the unmistakable pulse of old crimes, still breathing through the walls. In the West Wing, a room had been locked for nearly 50 years, sealed the day a child vanished, and a governess was found at dawn, wrists bloodied, a lullaby humming from her lips. No one spoke of that night now. though the household's quiet dread was carved into every worn stair and tarnished candelabra. At the library, Eleanor discovered an old journal hidden beneath false floorboards. A trembling hand had written entries full of fractured thoughts. The voices came again. "He told me not to open the chest." Another read, "She knew. That's why she's gone." And the final page simply said, "If someone reads this, do not trust the one who calls himself kin." As thunder cracked overhead and lights flickered, Eleanor felt the weight of the past press into the present. This wasn't about greed or madness alone. This was a lineage built on betrayal, and someone had killed to keep that foundation intact. Somewhere in this house, hidden behind bloodlines and birthrights, was the truth, and she, unlike those before her, had come to dig until it bled. Whatever had begun in that house decades ago had not, by any stretch, reached its end. It lingered, unresolved, festering beneath polished chandeliers and faded wallpaper like a second heartbeat. And so, with the kind of serene authority that could disarm armies, Eleanor Vane offered a simple suggestion over the faint clink of porcelain. Tea in the red drawing room. It was not a command, nor a plea, but something softer, a lull in the storm that no one dared resist. Soon, the principal figures of Grimsby Hollow assembled like chess pieces, seated on cracked velvet, their cups trembling, ever so slightly in saucers too delicate for the weight of the moment. Eleanor, ever gracious, spoke of inconsequential things. The dying ivy along the north wall, the sound of the rain against the bay windows, and how peculiar it was that certain homes seemed to remember more than the people inside them. By the second pour, the silences grew pregnant. By the third, the masks began to slip. Lady Winslow, upright as ever, spoke with polished ease, but her eyes flickered when Eleanor casually mentioned the bricked-over servants' quarters. She admitted, almost carelessly, that the estate had become too great a burden. Taxes bled them dry. Repairs were endless. The staff had dwindled to shadows. Selling, she said, was inevitable, if the last remnants of a complicated inheritance could be cleared. Her voice faltered just slightly at that "if." Eleanor noticed. She had seen that exact hesitation in others before. Those who carried the weight of unsigned documents and family histories steeped in unspoken debts. The trunk, it turned out, held more than heirlooms. Inside it, buried beneath false-bottomed compartments and brittle lace, was evidence of something that could fracture the entire lineage. A forged signature, a deed never meant to surface, a confession written in trembling ink. Across from Lady Winslow, Edward sat rigid, knuckles white against the cup, eyes darting not to Eleanor, but to the doors, the windows, any possible escape. He knew what she had found. He knew the past wasn't just returning, it was knocking. And someone in that room, maybe all of them, had heard the knock years ago, and chosen to pretend it was only the wind. Arthur Lennox's fingers wouldn't stay still, tapping, twitching, pulling at the hem of his cuff, as though his body conspired against him to reveal the truths he fought to bury. When Eleanor Vane, with her disarming warmth and air of gentle intrusion, casually remarked how lucky it must be for an only son to inherit such a magnificent estate, his laugh was brittle enough to snap. Luck had nothing to do with it. Arthur's gambling debts were the worst-kept secret from the village pub to the parish church, and his long string of failed ventures had turned his father's legacy into a noose tightening with each passing week. Hawthorne House, with its ivy-choked gables and collapsing west wing, was his last and only asset, provided, of course, that nothing inconvenient emerged from its ancient sealed-off corridors. Eleanor didn't push him. She didn't have to. When Lady Halbridge mentioned the East Wing and an inheritance under dispute, Arthur's hand jerked so violently that hot tea splashed onto his lap, unnoticed. But perhaps more curious than the son or the lady herself was the historian, an outlier among the guests, appearing at the gathering with impeccable timing, and a claim of casual interest in the estate's architecture. They were humble, impossibly polite, and far too well informed. They spoke of forgotten staircases and long-buried scandals with a familiarity that no amount of research could explain away. When Eleanor asked how they'd heard of the gathering, the answer was vague and poetic, something about old letters and literary interest. But Eleanor caught the tension in their jaw at the mention of the sealed study, the quick glance toward the east wing doors, and a flicker, yes, a flicker of something raw when the missing heir's name was spoken aloud. That wasn't academic curiosity, that was personal, a thread woven deep into the house's bloodline, perhaps a relative long thought lost, perhaps the secret the house had waited to exhale. And then there was the housekeeper, Agnes, quiet, weathered, and as much a fixture of the house as the ticking grandfather clock in the front hall. Her words were few, her tone mild, but her eyes screamed. She answered everything, yet revealed nothing. Eleanor had known her kind before, women who bore other people's sins as if they were their own, women who had seen things and said nothing. Her apron was pressed, her hair pinned, but Eleanor saw the truth trembling beneath the surface like a ghost at a locked door. Everyone in that room was protecting something, and Hawthorne House, like all places steeped in long shadows, was done being silent. The housekeeper, with her face frozen in an unyielding expression of calm, gave nothing away. But Miss Marple, ever the keen observer, noticed the faintest quiver in the woman's hands, the almost imperceptible flicker of unease in her eyes, whenever the conversation veered too close to dangerous territory. This housekeeper was a woman bound by more than just duty. Her loyalty was woven into the very fabric of the Harraby family's history. She had served them for decades, her family before her, a lineage of service passed down through generations. With that service came knowledge, secrets whispered in the shadows of the night, memories buried beneath layers of dust and years. Miss Marple could feel it, the weight of those secrets pressing down on the housekeeper's every move. The late-night footsteps that slipped across the cold floorboards, the letters sealed and burned without ever being read, the child who had disappeared from the estate, as quietly as a fading echo before anyone could question. This woman, quiet and composed, had witnessed it all, and with her silence came power. The power of knowledge. It was a silence so deep, it could smother the truth itself. But even the most practiced of masks had cracks, and Miss Marple, ever the diligent detective, had seen them. When she spoke casually of how houses remember what people so desperately want to forget, Miss Marple noticed the tiniest flutter in the housekeeper's hand, a tremble so subtle that only someone as perceptive as Miss Marple could catch it. It lasted but a moment, a mere flicker, yet it was enough to expose the truth that lay buried beneath decades of devotion and secrecy. The housekeeper had buried the past along with the Harraby family's legacy, and that past, hidden deep in the very stones of the house, was something far more dangerous than mere family scandal. It was a truth that could unravel everything, and the housekeeper knew it all too well. And Miss Marple, she knew this woman's loyalty wasn't just a bond of service. It was a shield, one that could turn deadly if the wrong questions were asked. As the evening unfolded, Miss Marple could feel the shift in the air. Guests who had once filled the hall with laughter now dispersed, their voices fading into the shadows. The house settled, its old bones creaking as if sighing with relief that the chaos had ended. But for Miss Marple, the night was far from over. With quiet deliberation, she wandered through the west wing, allowing herself to be swallowed by the labyrinth of rooms and corridors. Every inch of Hawthorne Hall held its own story, its own secret, and Miss Marple's mind replayed each word spoken earlier, every glance exchanged, every moment that carried an unspoken weight. She recalled Lady Harraby's tight-lipped smile, Richard's restless movements, the historian's too casual interest in the mysterious sealed room, and most telling of all, the housekeeper's unnerving silence. Each conversation had been a delicate dance of half-truths and veiled meanings, but what lingered beneath the surface was far more sinister than any of them had let on. It wasn't just a family scandal Miss Marple was unraveling. It was something much darker. Suddenly, A sound broke through the stillness behind her. Footsteps, soft yet unmistakable. Before she could turn, the push came. It was swift, forceful, sending her sprawling down the narrow staircase. Her body hit the stairs with a sickening thud, the pain shooting through her hip and elbow. But even as the pain flared, Miss Marple's sharp mind immediately recognized what this was. Not an accident, but a deliberate attempt to stop her. A warning. Bruised but far from beaten, she allowed herself exactly 3 minutes to recover. That was all she needed. The air was thick with the smell of danger now, and she could taste it, sharp and metallic in the back of her throat. Whoever had tried to silence her had just made a grave mistake. They had underestimated her. The fall, though painful, was nothing more than confirmation. She was getting close, too close to the heart of this mystery. The morning after, Miss Marple sat with her ankle propped up on a cushion, the sharp ache in her hip, a reminder of the night's violence. Pain, she knew well, could dull the body, but it sharpened the mind, and right now her mind was clearer than ever. As the household went about its usual routines, the whispers in the kitchen became impossible to ignore. The staff, once so composed, were now filled with nervous energy, casting furtive glances and speaking in hushed tones. Politeness reigned, but it was a veneer, thin and fragile. Beneath it was fear, palpable and suffocating. The housekeeper, always so quiet, seemed even more withdrawn than usual. Every movement she made was calculated. Every glance held a hint of something Miss Marple couldn't quite place. It wasn't just guilt. It was fear. Fear of what Miss Marple might discover. And Miss Marple, she knew that this wasn't simply about a family secret anymore. This was about something far more dangerous, something worth killing for. The tension in the air thickened, and Miss Marple could feel it in her bones. Someone in Hawthorne Hall wanted the truth to remain buried, and they would stop at nothing to keep it that way. With deliberate calmness, Miss Marple rose from her seat, each movement filled with purpose and quiet resolve. Her steps were sure as she made her way back toward the secret room, the room that had first piqued her curiosity, now a place that beckoned with the promise of truth, a truth that had already begun to bleed into her world, in unexpected ways. The danger was no longer subtle. An old woman had been pushed down the stairs, a harsh warning wrapped in the guise of an accident. The message was clear: someone would go to any lengths to keep their secrets buried. And Miss Marple, never one to shy away from a mystery, knew that this secret was not only worth uncovering, it was a key to unraveling the darkness festering inside Hawthorne Hall. Her fingers trembled, but only slightly, as she touched the familiar lid of the trunk. The feeling wasn't fear, it was anticipation. She had long ago learned that truth, no matter how elusive, always had a way of waiting for those patient enough to seek it. This time, her examination of the trunk was meticulous. She didn't just look at the surface treasures, the scattered pearls, the faded letters, the crumbling book whose pages had long since lost their significance. No, Miss Marple was focused on the trunk itself, the structure that held its secrets within its very bones. Her eyes traced the seams of the leather, the delicate places where the wood met the metal bindings, where the years had left their marks. It was then that she noticed it, the subtle, almost imperceptible difference. The sound, a soft, hollow tap when her knuckles brushed a section near the bottom. The sound was faint, but it was enough to send a wave of satisfaction rippling through her. False bottoms, she knew, were rarely used for convenience. They were designed to hide the inconvenient, the dangerous truths that some would kill to keep concealed. With the precision of a seasoned detective, Miss Marple pulled her knitting needle from the folds of her shawl, and gently probed the seam. The fabric gave way with a delicate rustle, and she carefully lifted the false bottom free. Nestled within, hidden from the world for so many years, was a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. The frayed ribbon that held it together had seen better days, its edges tattered by time and neglect. The bundle itself was stained with age, and something darker, something that whispered of secrets desperate to remain buried. Whoever had placed it here had gone to great lengths to preserve its contents, and whoever had hoped it would stay hidden had prayed for its silence to endure. Miss Marple's fingers unfurled the cloth to reveal a letter, its ink a deep, careful hand that had left no room for doubt. The date on the parchment was more than a century old, yet the handwriting was as clear as if it had been written the day before. The words that greeted her were eerily familiar, though she had seen them before, in the corners of other mysteries she had unraveled. This is a record of my own voluntary confession to be read in the event of my untimely death. The opening phrase was impersonal, almost formal. There was no tremor of emotion, no ink blots from a hand shaking with guilt or fear. The words were too neat, too deliberate, as if the confession was little more than a formality, more a legal document than a soul pouring out its burden. As Miss Marple read on, the confession painted a story of a crime of passion, a sudden quarrel in the secret room, a blow struck in anger, and a body disposed of beneath the very floorboards where she now stood. But as the words spilled from the page, she found herself growing uneasy. There was something off in the tone, something unsettling in the way the confessor had told their story. The language was too ornate, the explanations too thorough. It was as though the writer had been trying to convince not just the reader but themselves that this was the truth. The more she read, the more the words began to shift in her mind. What if this confession wasn't the whole story? What if the confessor was trying to cover up something far darker, something even more dangerous than what was written on the page? The more Miss Marple thought about it, the more she realized this was no ordinary confession. It was a carefully crafted story meant to mislead, to bury a deeper truth. A truth she was getting closer to uncovering with every turn of the page. Before anyone could utter a word, the voice that filled the room was not that of a broken heart, torn by guilt or sorrow. No, it was the cold, calculated voice of a lawyer, intent on sealing every potential escape route before it could even be considered. It was deliberate, methodical, a voice that spoke not from emotion but from a place of strategic precision. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught something subtle, yet undeniable. The victim was never named. The omission was not a mistake, nor a casual forgetfulness. It was deliberate, a strategic gap in the confession that rang louder than the words themselves. Here was a confession so thorough, so artfully composed, it almost begged for scrutiny. And yet the one detail that should have been central, the identity of the deceased, was absent. That single void, a hole in the narrative, was telling in a way no words could ever be. The more Miss Marple thought about it, the more the confession seemed like a script, carefully designed not to expose the truth, but to shape it into a narrative that would lead suspicion down a carefully chosen path. This was not a moment of guilt unburdened. It was a well-orchestrated performance, where the facts were manipulated with surgical precision. The absence of the victim's name allowed for flexibility, giving the storyteller the ability to shift the narrative should inconvenient facts ever arise. Miss Marple's fingers hovered over the paper, her mind working quickly to unravel the threads of deception. In her experience, those who committed crimes of passion didn't leave behind such precise legalistic documents. This was the work of a mind intent on control, not redemption. A mind that had crafted this confession not to unburden, but to direct the course of suspicion away from the true villain. The confession went on to describe a man, unnamed but portrayed in the darkest possible light. A servant, described as little more than a drunken thief, prone to violence, untrustworthy and volatile. It was a story too perfect, too neatly tied up, the kind whispered in servants' quarters, and used to explain away sudden staff changes in wealthy households. It was designed to fit a narrative, to justify the events in a way that would make them palatable to polite society, where the family's name was far more important than the truth. Miss Marple's lips tightened in silent disapproval as she read the words. She had spent a lifetime observing how the world viewed servants, how they were blamed when it was convenient and ignored when not. But Miss Marple knew better. She had seen too much in her years to believe this was the work of a servant. No. Servants were far too practical, too self-preserving, to get involved in family feuds. They knew when to turn a blind eye, when to sweep unpleasant truths under the carpet, and most importantly, when to leave well enough alone. This, Miss Marple realized, was not the crime of a servant. It was the crime of a family, and it had been carefully disguised, dressed up as something simpler, more understandable, something beneath the notice of the society that prided itself on polite appearances. This wasn't about class struggle or betrayal in the usual sense. It was about something deeper, something buried under layers of well-polished lies. Later, in the quiet solitude of her room, Miss Marple laid the confession beside her notes. Her fingers traced the timeline carefully, mapping out the events, each detail falling into place like the pieces of a puzzle she had seen many times before, but never quite like this. As the pieces connected, a chilling clarity swept over her. She was looking at the surface of a much darker truth, and it was only a matter of time before she would uncover it. The room, once sealed tight and untouched for generations, had now become the focal point of every suspicion and every whispered conversation. Downstairs, what had initially seemed like a collection of isolated incidents began to coalesce into a disturbing pattern, a tapestry woven from fear, greed, and guilt. Whoever had written the confession, with all its careful twists and omissions, had been clever. They had embedded enough truth to make their lies almost indistinguishable from the facts. Yet they had overlooked two things: the unshakable memory of the village, and the quiet, relentless persistence of an elderly lady who saw through the pretenses of human nature with startling clarity. Miss Marple's suspicions about the missing heir had not wavered. In fact, she was more certain than ever that the heir had never been missing at all. They had always been there, a part of the house, as integral to Hawthorne Hall as the weathered portraits on the walls and the creaking stairs beneath her feet. And now, with the sealed room finally open, and the past spilling forth from every corner, Miss Marple realized someone was prepared to kill again to keep the truth buried. With deliberate care, Miss Marple folded her notes, her mind racing with possibilities. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but the story was far from over. This was just the beginning. She knew where she needed to look next. The vicarage, with its quiet air of complacency, and its faded genteel charm, was the last place anyone would expect to uncover a secret. Yet, Miss Marple knew better. The vicarage was a place where, beneath the veneer of calm, everything had happened at one point or another, quietly, unspoken, but undeniably present. Over tea served in delicate china cups, which had long since seen their best days, Miss Marple sat with the vicar's wife, a woman of sharp wit, and an even sharper instinct for family secrets. The vicar's wife welcomed the opportunity to share the village's gossip, all under the guise of offering yet another scone, and pouring more tea. With each sip, she unwittingly unraveled a layer of the town's history, one that had long been buried under polite conversation and genteel facades. Miss Marple listened intently, her demeanor warm and inviting, giving no hint that she was mining these stories for much more than idle chatter. And as the vicar's wife spoke, she unwittingly began to peel away the thick layers of resentment, scandal, and long-forgotten grudges that had defined the families of Hawthorne Hall. The sealed room, as it turned out, was a point of obsessive fascination for the village, whispered about in hushed tones for generations. There had always been rumors of letters hidden within its walls, of promises made and broken, of debts unpaid, and most dangerously of all, of secrets far too dangerous to disturb. These were the kinds of secrets that could unravel families and bring down entire empires, and the village never forgot. It had always known, in a quiet collective way, that there was something buried in that room that no one should dare to uncover. Miss Marple, however, remained calm, her smile soft and distracted, as if she were merely humoring the vicar's wife's gossip. But beneath her serene exterior, the pieces of the puzzle were aligning in her mind with an unsettling clarity. The more the vicar's wife spoke, the more Miss Marple realized just how much the sealed room, and the mystery surrounding it, had been the heartbeat of this entire village. The truth was buried here, but for how long? It was only a matter of time before someone would do anything to ensure it stayed hidden. And Miss Marple knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that someone would stop at nothing to protect the legacy of Hawthorne Hall, even if it meant silencing anyone who got too close to the truth. Whenever people mistook Miss Marple for a harmless old dear, she knew well that villagers often held more secrets than they realized. They simply needed someone sharp enough to piece the fragments together, someone who could listen and understand what they weren't saying. It was in this way that the vicar's wife inadvertently introduced the topic of the will. It wasn't a deliberate choice, but rather a product of conversations laced with too much history and far too little discretion. The story came out in pieces years ago, when the old Harrowby patriarch passed away. A late amendment had been slipped into the back of the family Bible, an unexpected shift that changed everything. The inheritance was altered, benefiting one branch of the family, while leaving another disinherited. This sparked a feud that simmered beneath the surface, resurfacing whenever the village gathered for festivals or church services. The real kicker was the amendment itself, which the vicar's wife casually mentioned, was rumored to be tied to the secret room. The contents of the trunk inside were said to be key, potentially containing documents that could ruin everything, proof that a certain marriage never occurred, or that a legitimate heir was in fact illegitimate. The entire inheritance, the vicar's wife explained, could be overturned with the truth locked away in that room. Miss Marple, nodding thoughtfully, listened with the quiet attention of someone who was piecing together much more than the vicar's wife realized. She felt the delicate clicking of her knitting needles as a signal to her thoughts. The law, she mused, was often far more complex than crime itself. Crime, after all, was usually personal, driven by individual motives, but inheritance and honor, those were wounds that could linger for generations, festering with bitterness and unresolved grudges. A nursery rhyme, of all things, suddenly tugged at Miss Marple's memory. She recalled it from the hall, heard in passing while the housekeeper served tea, or when the fires were being laid. Miss Marple quietly murmured the fragment she could recall, and she saw the vicar's wife's face light up with recognition. It turned out that the rhyme was a favorite of the old nanny, a woman who had long since retired. Yet her memories seemed sharper than anyone else's. The nanny, it seemed, had been around during the scandal and silence surrounding the secret room. She had witnessed things, yet her lips were sealed, not out of forgetfulness, but out of loyalty, fear, or possibly guilt. Miss Marple's mind ticked along, processing the fragments. Nursery rhymes, she knew, could often be vessels for something far darker than simple children's songs. They were echoes of a time long past, hidden codes that often held the deepest secrets, buried under layers of innocence. The nanny, who had served the family through thick and thin, knew the true story of that room, but whether she would ever share it was another matter entirely. And Miss Marple, with her sharp instincts, realized that this particular piece of the puzzle was crucial, a key to understanding the very heart of the mystery. The deeper she delved into the past, the more she understood that this was not merely a dispute over inheritance. It was a battle for the truth, one that had been quietly simmering for decades, waiting for the right person to uncover it. And Miss Marple knew, with quiet certainty, that someone was desperately trying to keep it buried, even if it meant going to unimaginable lengths. Nursery rhymes, Miss Marple reflected, were never just for children. They had always carried more weight than most people realized. Beneath their innocent melodies, some were coded messages, deliberate puzzles woven with secrets, hidden truths, and occasionally ominous warnings. This fact became startlingly clear when news arrived that the elderly nanny, who had served at Hawthorne Hall, had vanished without a trace. The small cottage she'd lived in was found empty, her whereabouts unknown, as though she had simply disappeared into the night. No sign of struggle, no hint of where she could have gone. It was as though she had been swallowed by the very earth itself. Yet, amidst the eeriness of her disappearance, there was one detail that stood out, something left behind. A note, carefully tucked under a teapot on the kitchen table, its handwriting unsteady but clear. The words were simple, yet unsettling. Only a rhyme, the same one Miss Marple had heard whispered in the corners of the hall, murmured in passing by those who worked within the estate. But this time, one line was underlined twice, almost as though it was urging her to pay special attention. The rhyme was familiar, yet now it held a weight that it never had before. Miss Marple read the note aloud, her voice soft, but imbued with an unsettling clarity. Where the key lies cold and deep, the harrow heart must secrets keep. The rhyme, once thought to be a mere childhood song, now felt like a deliberate message, a final communication from someone who had known their time was short, and who could not speak the truth directly, for fear of the consequences. The elderly nanny, Miss Marple realized, had left her this cryptic message, not out of sentimentality, but because she understood that the time had come for the truth to be uncovered. The nanny had known the secrets buried within Hawthorne Hall, and now, in her final moments, she had left a trail, woven into the very fabric of the rhyme itself. After tea, with the delicate porcelain cups set aside, and the conversation finished, Miss Marple set off on a solitary walk back toward Hawthorne Hall. The words of the rhyme turned in her mind, each line tumbling over the other like a stone in her hand, smooth but with sharp edges, that she had yet to fully understand. Cold and deep was not a metaphor, she realized, but a literal description. The key, whatever it was, had been hidden away, forgotten in the passage of time, and now it was buried somewhere beneath the very walls of the house. Not a key to a door, she suspected, but to something far deeper, a key to the truth that had been buried along with the secrets of the estate. The phrase cold and deep echoed in her mind as she walked, growing louder with each step. It was clear to her now, the rhyme wasn't merely a warning, it was a map, a message left behind by someone who had known they wouldn't live long enough to reveal the full extent of the mystery, but who had left behind this cryptic puzzle, trusting that someone someday would hear the melody beneath the words. Someone who could interpret the message woven into the lullaby, and finally bring the truth to light. As she approached the gates of Hawthorne Hall, her thoughts were sharp, her senses on high alert. She gazed at the distant west wing of the estate, where the secret room lay. The room had been sealed for generations, its contents locked away in mystery. Whoever had sealed it had done so with the clear intention of leaving no way back, no possibility of the past being resurrected. Yet, Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that the vanished nanny, or perhaps the missing heir, had left something behind. Perhaps, buried in plain sight, was a hidden door, a way to reopen the past that had been sealed away for far too long. The past, she thought, was never as silent as people hoped it would be. It lingered in the walls, in the creaking floorboards, in the faintest of whispers that escaped at night. Once a nursery rhyme began to hum again, there was no silencing it. It would reverberate through the halls, resonating with the echoes of forgotten secrets, until it could no longer be ignored. Miss Marple stood at the gates, her mind ticking methodically. The rhyme, the nanny's disappearance, the missing heir, all of it was connected, intricately woven into a tapestry of long-hidden truths. The truth, Miss Marple was certain, was closer than it had ever been before. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and it was only a matter of time before the past would no longer be silent. The room was a study of contrasts, filled with guests and staff still caught in the aftershock of a shocking event. Some wore mourning black, while others remained caught in the brittle calm that follows too much excitement, like the lingering quiet after a storm. Miss Marple sat composed in the corner, her hands delicately folded in her lap. Her smile was gentle, but to anyone unfamiliar with the woman, she might have appeared as just another pleasant elderly lady, content to offer her service. However, those who had lived long enough in St. Mary Mead knew better. There was a subtle yet unshakable confidence in her demeanor, something in the way she sat, still yet alive with purpose. It was a quiet assurance of a woman who had already unraveled the secrets hidden in the shadows, who had pieced together the puzzle long before anyone else had even noticed the missing pieces. She didn't ask questions, she didn't press for confessions. Instead, Miss Marple began to tell a story, one that stretched back over a century, yet found its tragic conclusion only the night before. Her words, soft and steady, filled the room as she recounted how a child's innocent game had unknowingly led to the discovery of a secret room, long thought lost to the ravages of time and memory. This seemingly harmless revelation, in hindsight, would prove to be the catalyst that set everything into motion. A trunk, old letters, a brooch gone missing. Each seemingly small detail was a thread in the fabric of a much older, more sinister tale, carefully concealed beneath layers of family legend. As Miss Marple continued, her eyes held the room's attention, offering no direct accusations, but weaving a web of truth with subtlety. The victim, she explained, had unknowingly stumbled too far into the past. A chance overheard remark at a garden party, a fleeting glimpse of a document hidden in the trunk. Each small fragment was enough for them to realize that the history of Hawthorne Hall was more than a family scandal. It was a criminal history, one buried deep beneath the estate's polished surface. The victim, Miss Marple revealed, had returned to the secret room that very night, hoping to confirm their suspicions. But they were not alone. Someone else had followed. A shadow in the dark, someone who knew all too well that the wrong discovery could unravel everything. The inheritance, the estate, it would all collapse like a house of cards if the truth came to light. Miss Marple's voice held the room in quiet authority as she revealed what the victim had found. A forgery so expertly crafted, it was nearly indistinguishable from the genuine family papers. But it was a forgery, and its intent was clear: to rewrite the terms of inheritance, ensuring that the estate would fall into the hands of the person who had the most to lose from the truth. This was no mere trick of pen and ink. It was a calculated crime, a scheme that had festered in the shadows for years. The victim had been on the verge of exposing the forgery, perhaps even confronting the family with it. But in the deadly dance of secrets, someone had anticipated this move. Someone who knew that if the forged document was exposed, it would tear apart the fragile web of lies that held their inheritance intact. In the stillness of the room, the weight of the truth began to settle on the guests and staff, their faces betraying a mixture of disbelief and dawning realization. Miss Marple paused, allowing the silence to stretch, knowing that her revelation had just begun to break the surface of something far deeper and far darker. A cold, calculated crime had been hidden beneath layers of family loyalty, and the victim had died in the pursuit of justice. But now, as the puzzle pieces began to fall into place, Miss Marple knew that the truth had a way of revealing itself when the time was right, no matter how long it took. The killer struck swiftly, the movement almost preordained, as if fate had already decided the victim's end long before that fatal night. The Harobi silk scarf, chosen with chilling precision, wasn't selected for its comfort or practicality. No, it was a symbol, a weapon meant to carry a far more profound message than mere murder. This wasn't a desperate act for wealth or power, it was a calculated statement, a brutal warning to anyone who might dare to peel back the crumbling layers of Hawthorne Hall's carefully maintained facade. Those who had built their lives around this family's dark history were willing to go to any length to preserve the fragile lie they had been living. Miss Marple's voice, soft as always, lacked pity or sympathy, but there was an unmistakable weariness in her tone. It was the kind of tiredness that comes from years of watching human nature reveal itself in its most twisted forms. She knew that people rarely change, and the patterns of deception, greed and betrayal were all too familiar to her. The murder before them wasn't just an isolated tragedy. It was the culmination of a century of secrets, whispered promises, and broken lives. The killer, Miss Marple revealed, was not an outsider, as some might have assumed, but one of their own. A Harobi, someone raised within the walls of Hawthorne Hall, nurtured by its family history, and bound to it by the chains of a legacy they could never escape. Years earlier, this very person had taken the necessary steps to alter the family will, a will that would have passed the estate to another branch of the family. They had meticulously forged the documents, ensuring that the inheritance would flow to them instead, turning the family's history into a personal fortune. This act had been covered up so carefully that no one could ever suspect its existence. But hidden in plain sight was the secret room, a place long thought to be nothing more than an oddity, a relic of times gone by. The room, however, had become far more than that. It was a ticking time bomb, containing the unaltered will, the one that would expose the whole charade. Miss Marple's gaze flickered across the room, as if she could see the secret room itself in her mind's eye. She explained how the victim had unknowingly stumbled upon the truth. It was an accidental discovery at first, perhaps an innocent glimpse of a letter hidden in an old trunk, or a fleeting conversation overheard at a garden party. But once the victim realized the truth, they could not ignore it. The history of Hawthorne Hall was far more than scandalous. It was criminal. And that discovery was the spark that set everything into motion. But the killer, knowing the consequences of this revelation, acted swiftly. They followed the victim into the library that night, their hand gripping the Harrowby silk scarf with cold determination. The moment of reckoning had arrived. The silence of the house was broken only by the faint rustling of paper and the soft creak of floorboards, as the two moved deeper into the mansion's shadows. The killer was not just motivated by greed or fear of exposure. They were driven by a need to preserve the carefully crafted illusion of a legacy that was built on lies. The silk scarf was not just an instrument of death. It was a symbolic act, one that tied the present to the past, a past filled with shame, betrayal, and forbidden love. Miss Marple paused for a moment, allowing the weight of the story to sink in. She spoke with a quiet authority, knowing that the family before her had already been living in a prison of their own making, trapped by their own secrets for decades. The family's history was littered with betrayals, and the murder wasn't the first crime in the Harrowby legacy. No, the true tragedy had begun much earlier. A young Harrowby daughter had fallen in love with someone deemed unworthy by the cold standards of her family. Her forbidden romance had set off a chain reaction that ultimately resulted in the sealing of the secret room, the altering of the will, and the family's eventual unraveling. Each crime, Miss Marple continued, built upon the last, a twisted inheritance of guilt and shame that had been passed down from one generation to the next. Each family member had been burdened with secrets they couldn't face, and in the process, they had slowly destroyed themselves. The silk scarf, which had been used to end the victim's life, was the same thread that had woven this family's tragic fate. It was a symbol of the very thing that had choked the life out of them, their desperate need to protect a legacy they could no longer defend. Lady Harrowby's face, though lined with grief, now bore the unmistakable marks of realization. The weight of the truth had hit her like a hammer, and in that moment, she understood that the legacy they had worked so hard to protect had been the very thing that had condemned them all. Miss Marple's voice, always so gentle, carried a quiet finality. "Houses remember," she said softly, "and so do villages. In the end, justice is not just about serving the law, it's about restoring what was lost. It's about reclaiming the truth." The police, summoned discreetly after the gathering, did their work without fanfare, leading the killer away with no dramatic confessions, no frantic denials. There were no tearful breakdowns or accusatory shouts, only the sound of heavy footsteps echoing through the ancient halls, and the faintest creak of a door closing on yet another Harrowby secret. Miss Marple, in her usual composed manner, accepted the last cup of tea from Lady Harrowby, exchanging polite farewells. As the family retreated into their silence, Lady Harrowby's expression remained fixed in a state of shock, her grief now compounded by the crushing weight of the truth she had never wished to face. Miss Marple's final thoughts as she sat alone with her cup of tea were not filled with triumph or satisfaction. No, she understood all too well that justice while served was rarely the victory it was made out to be. Sometimes it was the quiet, unspoken acknowledgement of the past, the recognition that some things once buried can never be fully forgotten. The resolution of this dark tale was far from the satisfying closure one might expect from the neatly wrapped endings of novels, or the heroic unmasking of villains in plays. Instead, it was much quieter, more profound in its delivery, a conclusion that lingered, heavy with the weight of understanding. It was not an ending marked by celebration, but by a deep, haunting acknowledgement that human folly wasn't a puzzle to be pieced together and solved. No, it was a flaw, one that was not easily eradicated, but rather one that had to be endured, silently, as it festered within the bones of every person involved. Miss Marple, standing at the edge of the hallway, felt the stillness of the moment settle over her like an impenetrable fog. There were no dramatic gestures, no triumphant shouts of aha, in this room, only the heavy, suffocating silence that accompanied the weight of revelation. The mystery, as complex and consuming as it had been, had unraveled, yet its resolution left a bitter taste, the kind of taste that lingered long after the final truth had been revealed. It was, in essence, a story that had not truly ended. It had only shifted, moving deeper into the core of human nature itself. As Miss Marple approached the threshold of the hidden room, the air grew notably cooler, a shiver creeping down her spine, not from fear, but from the uncanny sensation that the house was alive. Not in the traditional sense, but alive with the echoes of the past, the whispers of secrets and regrets long buried. It was as though the very walls of the mansion had held its breath for generations, and now, at last, the moment had come for it to exhale, a heavy, exhausted exhalation that carried with it the scent of sorrow and lost time. The room she stood before was no longer just a physical space. It had become a symbol of everything the house had tried to suppress: love, betrayal, murder, and the slow erosion of a family's soul. It had witnessed the slow, inexorable decay of the Harrowby family's legacy, piece by tragic piece. Miss Marple, standing in the silence, could almost hear the muted cries that had echoed in this room over the years, sobs stifled by pride, words unsaid due to fear, and confessions that had never been made for the sake of family honor. The room, she realized, had absorbed all of it. Each moment of heartbreak, each dark secret, had seeped into the very fabric of this house, stitching it together in ways no one could have predicted. The killer, it seemed, had simply been a final tragic thread woven into the tapestry of this family's downfall. What began as an illicit love affair, a forbidden romance that had ignited a bitter feud, had led to a chain of decisions and actions that could never be undone. What had begun as one person's attempt to break free from the cold, judgmental hands of their family had spiraled into a series of tragedies that no one could have foreseen. The sealing of the secret room, the forging of the will, it had all been part of a desperate attempt to preserve the family's name, to protect its supposed honor. But in doing so, they had condemned themselves to a cycle of deceit, each generation burying the past deeper and deeper, until the house itself became a graveyard for the truth. As Miss Marple reflected on all of this, she realized that the true nature of justice was rarely as clear-cut as one might think. Justice, in this case, had not come with the fanfare of a courtroom triumph, or the catharsis of a villain's unmasking. It had come quietly, almost imperceptibly, like the fall of night. It was not a neatly tied conclusion, but a somber acknowledgement of the lives that had been lost, the choices that had been made, and the generations that had carried the weight of their ancestors' sins. Standing at the door of the secret room, Miss Marple could feel the lingering presence of all those who had walked these halls before her. The house had not only been a witness to their actions, it had become a reflection of their flaws, their fears, and their pride. And now, it seemed, the house had claimed its own justice in the form of a quiet revelation, as though the very walls had made their peace with the past. But what of the rest of the story? What of the sorrow that remained? The regrets that could never be fully expunged? Miss Marple knew that justice was only ever part of the equation. The rest, the sorrow, the broken relationships, the weight of choices made out of pride, belonged to the house now. The mansion had become more than just a setting. It had become a living entity, one that could remember, one that could never forget. And in the end it had claimed its due. As Miss Marple stood at the threshold of that room, gazing into the cold, lifeless space, she couldn't help but think about the house's enduring power. Houses, after all, don't just shelter, they hold on to memories, sometimes for longer than the living would like to admit. And Hawthorne Hall, for all its grandiosity, for all its wealth and history, had become a tomb for the secrets that had been buried within its walls. The memories that the house had held were not simply the echoes of those who had lived here. They were the very fabric of the tragedy that had unfolded within these walls. Would those memories ever be truly at rest? Could the house ever be freed from the ghosts of its past? Or would the secrets continue to whisper, waiting for the next soul brave enough to uncover them? Miss Marple, as always, had her own thoughts, but she knew that this was not a question she could answer. The house itself would have to decide when the past had finally caught up with it, and whether the future could ever escape its shadow. And then, as Miss Marple turned to leave, she posed one final question, one that hung in the air like a heavy fog. If you discovered the deepest, darkest secret of your family, a secret so vile, so destructive, would you have the courage to reveal it? Would you expose the truth, no matter the cost, or would you bury it, just as your ancestors had done, to preserve the fragile veneer of respectability and family honor? It was a question that Miss Marple, with all her wisdom, knew the answer to, but one that would forever remain open, like the creaking door of Hawthorne Hall, forever waiting for the next secret to make its way into the light. Imagine standing where Miss Marple stands, in the quiet, shadowed corners of a vast estate, Hawthorne Hall, a mansion that has lived through more secrets than it could ever fully hold. The air is thick with the weight of history, and every stone in the house seems to whisper its own secrets, ones buried deep beneath the polished floors and grand echoing halls. The discovery of the dark secret of your family, its roots stretching back through generations, lies in your hands. Now you must decide. Will you reveal it to the world, even if doing so means unraveling everything your family has fought to protect? Or will you, like Miss Marple, choose the quieter path, to bury the truth once again, to preserve what's left of a family that was once held together by nothing more than fragile illusions? As Miss Marple stands in the threshold of the secret room, she knows better than anyone the true cost of revealing such a truth. She's seen it all before, the slow decay of families bound by secrets so thick they can hardly breathe beneath the weight of them. Yet she understands something far deeper. Some secrets are like cancers. They cannot be ignored forever, no matter how deeply they are buried. You can lock them away, seal them behind doors that are meant to be forgotten, but the truth, much like the light of day, always finds a way to creep through the cracks. Would you have the courage to bring that light into the darkness? Or would you choose to keep the truth buried, thinking that by protecting the present, you might somehow spare the future? The house, after all, remembers everything. It remembers the forbidden love affair that set the entire tragedy in motion, the betrayal, the cruelty, and the final tragic act that sealed the fate of an entire family. The walls of Hawthorne Hall have absorbed it all. And as Miss Marple knows, in houses like these, the past never truly disappears. It waits quietly, patiently, for the right moment to rise again. In her mind, Miss Marple knows this is not just the end of a murder investigation. It's the final act of a tragedy decades in the making. Every generation of the Hawthorne family was forced to carry the weight of the past, its sins, its lies, and its impossible secrets, until it shattered under its own weight. The silk scarf that ended one life in cold blood was a symbol of this cycle, this twisted inheritance of betrayal, woven into the very fabric of the family. It was not just a scarf. It was the tangible thread that connected generations, each bound by a sin that couldn't be forgotten. Now Miss Marple, with all her wisdom and her quiet understanding of human nature, faces the ultimate question: what to do with the truth once it's finally revealed. Would you, as she does, quietly observe the killer led away in silence, knowing that justice, though served, is far from the end of the story? There's no dramatic courtroom scene, no theatrical unmasking in front of a cheering crowd, just the soft, inevitable step of justice unfolding in the background, as though it were always meant to be this way. The house itself seems to breathe a sigh of relief, as though a long-held secret has finally been let out into the open. Yet there's no real sense of closure. Some things are simply too deep to be fully healed. And yet, as Miss Marple reflects, the true cost of this justice isn't found in the public spectacle of the murderer's arrest, but in the quiet, slow-burning ache of a family undone by its own pride. The unspoken burden of regret, of knowing that everything that came after, the broken relationships, the years of lies, the blood spilled in the name of preservation, could have been avoided. But would it have been? Could Miss Marple have ever truly untangled the web of lies without revealing the truth, no matter how painful? As she stands at the threshold of the secret room, the air feels colder, almost as though the house itself is letting out its final breath, after holding its secrets for so long. The truth that had been hidden behind the walls, under the floorboards, in forgotten rooms and locked trunks, is now free. But it is free to do what? What does freedom mean when the damage has already been done? When the fabric of a family is so frayed, does the truth really set anyone free? Or does it simply leave everyone to face the consequences of their own choices? Miss Marple's thoughts linger on the legacy of the Hawthorne family. She knows the truth is a force, one that cannot be controlled, no matter how hard the family tried to lock it away. It's there, in the walls, in the ground, in the very air they breathe. Even now, as the killer is led away in silence, there's a feeling that the house remembers everything. It remembers the love, the hate, the triumphs, and the failures, and it will always carry the weight of those secrets, even after they are revealed. So the question remains, what would you do if you discovered your family's darkest secret? Would you reveal it to the world, knowing the pain it might cause? Or would you, like Miss Marple, let it rest quietly once again, sealed away, out of sight and mind? Share your thoughts below, because this is more than just a story. It's a reflection on what we choose to keep hidden, what we're willing to expose, and the price we pay for protecting, or destroying the ones we love. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, so you never miss another story filled with secrets, lies and unexpected twists. Share this mystery with your friends, fellow mystery lovers, and let them ponder. Would they too choose to uncover the past, or would they bury it, one more time, for the sake of family and legacy? As we leave Hawthorne Hall behind, we know this much is true: some secrets are never really gone. They're simply waiting for the right moment to emerge. Because in houses like these, where the past lives on, the truth will always find its way back into the light.